Hello everyone, good morning, or afternoon, evening, or middle of the night, as the case may be. So welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to be taking a look at the rest of our material in the philosophy of mind. So we've got pieces from Frank Jackson and Alan Turing. The Turing piece, it's really just a couple of pages. Not too much to say on him, but there's certainly something interesting going on there. So we'll start with Jackson's piece, Epiphenomenal Qualia, or Qualia. Again, there's two ways of pronouncing that word, and I've heard it pronounced both ways by people who study this sort of thing, so I'm not going to feel too bad if I switch back and forth between them a little bit. I'll try to say Qualia for the most part, but you know, you can run a tally if you want to see how many times I contradict myself. So Jackson himself, Australian philosopher, has worked largely on philosophy of mind, some other related areas, but this is really what he's known for. In particular, this actual paper that we're looking at, as well as a closely related paper, one that's quite similar to this one, are really his claims to fame. He's still at the Australian National University as a professor emeritus now, which basically means you're retired, but you still have special distinction and they keep you around in some sense, perhaps give you an office or something like that. So this piece itself that we're looking at, it's fairly short, fairly sweet. As you're going to see, there's actually, we're going to take a look at really the first section, the knowledge argument. And if you take a look at the workbook questions, I don't have any workbook questions on the next couple of sections, the modal argument and what it's like to be a bat argument. They're interesting. They're in there to read them. There might be some interesting material there that you could engage with. I'm going to largely skip over. I'm not going to ask any test questions on it either on the final. So it's there if you want. It's really just a couple more pages. But if you want, you can skip through those couple other sections and really look at the knowledge argument and then the later parts of the article. So this piece, Epiphenomenal Qualia, what's Jackson going to do? Well, he's going to do three things for us, really. Introduces Qualia and gives us this knowledge argument for Qualia, which ultimately is an argument against physicalism. Argues against three reasons to think that Qualia are causally efficacious. And finally, really makes a claim of humility, saying that our inability to explain Qualia and why they exist isn't a reason to reject that they exist. So we're going to see really what Jackson's doing in this piece is responding to Smart. Because of course, if you think back to our previous lecture, what did we have? Well, Smart there argued for the identity theory, the mind-brain identity theory. What was that? It's a version of physicalism. Physicalism is really the view that all that exists are physical things. If something's not physical, it doesn't exist. There's physicalism. The identity theory really just says minds just are brains. Brains are physical things, those exist. Minds, if they're anything other than just a physical thing like a brain, then they can't exist because only physical things exist. So on Smart's view, what we really have are brains. And all mental talk can hopefully at some point in the future be replaced by talk about brains and what's going on in brains. Now, Smart resisted a couple other views. One was dualism, the view that minds really are something separate. There's something over and above and different from physical things. Right? Minds are non-physical. They aren't in space. You can't touch them or see them like that. But on the dualist view, the dualist interactionist view, those immaterial or non-physical minds still are causally efficacious. They make things happen. We're going to see that Jackson wants to preserve the view that there are non-physical mental things of some sort. These are what the Qualia are. But he's going to resist the view, he's going to reject the view that they're causally efficacious, that they actually do anything. So Jackson is defending a sort of minimalist view in philosophy of mind, resisting what Smart's after. Now, the other view Smart was after was behaviorism, which really just says all that there are physical things, behaviors. That's all we should study. That's all we can really talk about. We shouldn't even be engaged in mind talk really at all. So if somebody says, I feel pain, don't infer from that that they're actually feeling anything. Really, it's just a kind of behavior, right? When you cut them or something, and then they say, ouch, I'm in pain, that hurts. All that's really going on is behaviors. Smart thinks that view is fairly impoverished, but there is more going on, namely brain states. When somebody gets cut or they actually get hurt, what's going on? Well, their body's in a certain physical state that makes their brain enter a certain kind of state. And when we say something like, I'm in pain, what we're doing is reporting what state our brain or body more generally is in. So we're going to see Jackson. Jackson doesn't like behaviorism either. He thinks that's a bad view. But if Smart is trying to sort of carve a middle ground between dualism on the one hand and behaviorism on the other, Jackson is sort of halfway between Smart and dualism. Because Jackson wants to say, well, there's more going on than just brains. But he wants to agree with Smart that minds, whatever those are really, don't have any sort of causal influence on physical things in the world. All right, so let's take a look at the arguments themselves. So first, this knowledge argument, Qualia and the knowledge argument. What's going on here? Well, Jackson himself puts it in pretty funny terms. He says he's a Qualia freak. What does he mean? Well, he tells us. He says, I think that there are certain features of the bodily sensations especially, but also certain perceptual experiences, which no amount of purely physical information includes. That is, if we had all the physical information about what's going on when we feel something or see something, right? See a color or feel pain or something like that. Even if we had all the physical information, say neuroscience was perfected, neuroscience and all the biological sciences were done. They'd explored everything there was to explore. We could give you all the information you wanted about it. Jackson's view is that we would still be missing something in our explanation. There would be something more to be said, namely, something to be said about the hurtfulness of pains, the itchiness of itches, pangs of jealousy, right? Anything like this. What it's like to have a certain kind of sensation. What it's like to feel something, or see something, or smell something. Look, we can explain colors by talking about the light spectrum and refraction and wavelengths and all that kind of stuff. But it's something different to see certain colors than to know about what wavelength of light causes that certain kind of color to be produced. Or it's one thing to talk about, say, the chemicals that go on in, say, a rose or a nice smelling flower, how that interacts with our olfactory system, you know, how we smell it, how that interacts with certain areas, how it makes certain parts of the brain activate in certain ways. We could say all that, but that's something different from actually smelling the rose. This is really what Jackson's trying to get at. So what's the argument he gives us? Well, he gives us this knowledge argument for Qualia. He gives us two versions of it. So we'll take a quick look at each of those versions, but they really amount to the same thing. So the first one is about Fred the tomato sorter. So imagine we've got Fred, and we have all the physical information there is to know about Fred. Now, he successfully sorts ripe tomatoes into two groups very consistently, and he reports he does so based on their color variation. Think back to Smart for a moment, when Smart introduced the normal percipient, and he says, look, really we can think about people in an idealized way. You've got the normal percipient. Who's that? Well, somebody who can make color discriminations in a very reliable sort of way, and that's how we pick out things like, oh, this is red and that's green and this other thing's purple and whatever it is, because of the sorts of capabilities humans have to reliably sort these things out, right? And we take the sort of normal or average percipients, or the human standard. That's, in some sense, where we set the bar. And then based on that, we've got deviations. As I was mentioning last time, some people can actually see more colors than many of the rest of us. Some people see less. Some people have, you know, some degree of color blindness or something like that. And that's exactly what Smart's talking about. Now, Jackson's talking about the same thing here. Now, he's got Fred the tomato sorter. As I mentioned last time, there are, in fact, people who have an extra cone in their eye so they can see all sorts of extra colors that sort of average or normal people can't see. What Jackson gets wrong is that he's got Fred the tomato sorter, but from my understanding, it's only women that have this extra cone. So there's a small percentage of women who see many, many more colors than the rest of us do. So I think, now Jackson's just speculating. This is new. That people have this extra cone and can see these extra colors is something that's come out since Jackson wrote this piece in '82. So Jackson's just sort of speculating here. It would have been very nice if the example here would have been a woman instead of a man, then you could have said, oh, look, I knew that was coming. But we'll see in the second example, he's got Mary as the example there. So just coming back to this, so we have Fred the tomato sorter. Fred sorts tomatoes, ripe tomatoes, which all look red, into these two groups. Somehow we figure out which tomatoes belong in which groups. We keep mixing them up. We give them back to Fred. He sorts them back out into the different groups in a regular way, right? He keeps sorting them into the same two groups, tells us that he's doing so by color. We've developed some kind of scheme so we can keep track of them because we can't see any difference in the color variation, right? And so again, really what's going on here is Fred sees more colors than we do. He's better able to discriminate between different shades of red in the tomatoes than we are. That's how he's doing this. Well, what can we conclude from this? Assuming that this really happens, and in fact could happen, depending on who's doing the sorting, what kind of color vision they have. Jackson tells us this. He says, we have all the physical information. Therefore, knowing all this physical information is not knowing everything about Fred. It follows that physicalism leaves something out, because physicalism is the thesis that a full explanation of the world will only require physical information. So in this example, this thought experiment, which is a sort of thing philosophers cook up, right? We cook up an example that shows what we want it to show, and as long as it's possible that the example is true, we can use it to try to make some kind of point. Here what Jackson's doing is just trying to make the point that physicalism is wrong, because physicalism holds that if you have all the physical information, you know everything there is to know, because there just aren't non-physical things, so there's nothing to be explained beyond the physical. Now, in Fred's case, just for the purpose of the example, we have all the physical information. Imagine we know everything there is to know about Fred. We know his eyes work and how his brain works and how light interacts with that system. And we know all that stuff. We know all the biology and all of the neuroscience. We know all the physics. We know all of the information, all the physical information we need to know to fully explain in physical terms how he's seeing the tomatoes and sorting them and all that stuff. But there's still something physicalism leaves out. There's still something that physical explanation leaves out, namely what it's like for Fred to see those different shades of red. Right? We don't know that if we have all the physical information about his situation. Let's take a look at the second example, which really, like I said, amounts to basically the same thing. We've got Mary, the brilliant neuroscientist. Now, something unusual about Mary is that she's grown up in a black and white room with a black and white television set. So she's never seen colors. Now, I'm not sure if somehow, maybe her clothes are this sort of color. They're all just in black and white as well. So she learns everything there is to know through a black and white television set. Learns everything there is to know about human brain functioning. Right? She learns everything you need to know about neuroscience in black and white, including how color vision works. So she knows all the physical information she needs to know about color vision, but she hasn't seen colors. Now, once she leaves the room and sees color for the first time, Jackson asks, will she learn anything or not? It seems just obvious that she will learn something about the world and our visual experience of it. Right? If she leaves the room and sees color for the first time, even though she knows all the physical information about how it is somebody sees colors, she's still going to learn something when she actually sees colors for the first time. Because she learns something more when she actually sees colors, rather than just knowing about what happens when someone sees colors, Jackson concludes that physicalism is false because there's something more than just the physical information to be known. So this is really the argument. This is the knowledge argument, that the experience of qualia itself, or qualia, that experience lets us know something we otherwise wouldn't know. So just knowing the physical information alone is not enough to know everything there is to know, because there's something more to know, namely what it's like of an experience, what it's like to smell a rose or feel pain or be happy, or put in anything you want here, right? Any sort of mental experience, that kind of mental talk where we say, I feel this, or I'm thinking this, or I'm, anything that's going on in our mental lives, where Smart would say, well, at some point, if I'm right, we can explain all that in terms of what's going on in the brain. Jackson say, well, no, because that's just more physical information. That's just telling us, oh, this part of the brain is activated. But that's something different from smelling a rose or feeling happy or whatever it might be. Now, I'm going to just stick this in here briefly as something to think about. One way of trying to respond to Jackson's argument here on behalf of, say, SMART, is to respond in this kind of way. Jackson, what you're really doing is distinguishing between the sort of brain state we're in when we learn information about brain states and being in the actual brain state of, say, seeing color, what we call seeing color or feeling pain or, you know, the sorting tomatoes or whatever. There's a difference between coming to know about somebody else having some kind of experience and having the experience yourself. When you have the experience yourself, then your brain is actually in the right state. When you're only learning about that brain state, right, from the outside, so to speak, you're just having a different kind of experience. Your brain just isn't in the state of, say, seeing color. It's in the state of, I don't know, learning some sentences about what it's like for brains to see color, something like that. So think about that. That's an interesting potential way to engage with Jackson's argument. Not necessarily, in fact, that might be wrong. So I offered this on behalf of SMART, but you might actually say, no, there's something incorrect about that. No, maybe. It's potential there for a critical response. Okay. Now, I already mentioned this, but we'll talk about it in just a little bit more detail here because Jackson takes some time to defend this view. He defends epiphenomenalism. I know that's a big word. It's quite the mouthful. Epiphenomenalism. What is that? Well, really, it's just the view that qualia, which are really mental properties of some sort, right? What it's like to feel pain or something like this. This is really all Jackson's trying to defend. He doesn't need sort of a big, robust consciousness. Just that kind of stuff, that feeling, right? That kind of property. He doesn't even need big mental processes. He doesn't need sort of a full mind separate from the body. He just wants to say when certain things are happening to your body, you get qualia produced as well. And that's the what it's like to have an experience. Even though he defends that these things exist, that there are these mental properties that exist over and above physical processes, physical events, physical substances, he holds the view that they're not causally efficacious, right? They're actually inert. What are they then? They're a byproduct. So what's going on in a human body or any body is really primarily a set of physical processes. So in a way, Jackson is agreeing with SMART. This is why I said, you know, SMART is trying to hold this middle ground between dualism and behaviorism. Jackson's sort of between dualism and SMART's view, sort of out in the middle somewhere. Because the full-blown dualist wants to say mental stuff has a causal role to play. Jackson doesn't. He's a little closer to SMART and saying we should actually privilege physical processes, what's going on in the body and the physical environment. That's how you really explain what's going on, right? You don't appeal to these qualia to really explain on a base level what's happening in the world, but to have a full explanation of what's happening, you have to include these qualia because you just can't explain them in physical terms, though you can explain how they're produced in physical terms. So qualia are a byproduct of physical processes, right? The physical processes are causally efficacious, but the qualia that are produced by them are not. They don't have any causal influence on anything. So they get produced as a side effect, and then they're done. They disappear. They don't have any further role to play in the world. So there are three objections to this view that qualia are epiphenomenal, that they aren't causally efficacious. We're going to take a look at each of them and Jackson's response. And this is sort of summing it up. So if any of these seem interesting, it might be worth looking at the section of the reading just to see what it is he's saying, and that might be another good way to do a critical response. Zoning in on one of these and trying to argue whether or not Jackson gets it right. So first, it just seems obvious that qualia is efficacious, or qualia are efficacious, right? For instance, if you hurt yourself, right, you prick your finger or something, and then you pull your hand away from whatever cut you, right? Our normal thinking on this is that it's the feeling of pain that really makes you avoid that pain stimulus, right? So whatever it is that causes pain, it's the pain that we experience that makes us pull back. If we didn't experience the pain, we wouldn't react the way we do, right? It's because somebody feels angry that they fly into a fit of rage and behave certain ways. Something like this, right? It just seems obvious that the actual what it's like to have an experience plays some sort of causal role. Jackson responds to that. He says, well, it's possible, but we don't have to believe that. And in fact, we have a simpler and better explanation of the world if we say qualia exists, because we have to say that to have a full explanation. To deny it the way SMART does is to miss something important. But we don't have to say that they actually are causally efficacious. A simpler explanation is that just physical processes explain everything. And one cause can have multiple effects. In this case, one physical cause can have multiple effects. That is, say, a pain stimulus, itself a physical cause, say like a pin pricks your finger or something. That can have two separate effects. One effect is that it causes our body to react to it. So the physical cause of your feeling of pain is what causes your body to react. That stimulus and how it interacts with your body is also what causes the feeling of pain. Right? So we've got one thing, say the pinprick on your finger, that causes both your body to react and pull away. It also causes you to feel the pain. Now, this all happens very quickly. And so it's a pretty forgivable mistake to misunderstand the causal relations here and to believe, mistakenly, Jackson thinks, that it's the feeling of pain that causes our body to react the way it does. Okay? Rather, it all happens rather quickly, but really what's going on is that it's that physical interaction that causes you to feel pain and causes your body to react. But it's not your feeling pain that makes your body react that way. Both of those things are effects. Now, I'm not going to say this for certain, in part because I want to offer this as something to think about, something to potentially research or carry forward. There is some work on how exactly people interact with pain stimuli, right? When they get hurt or something like that and they're trying to react, what's really going on? I believe, and I'll leave it to you to see if I'm right about this, there is work, there's at least one study that shows that people react before they report actually feeling pain, or it's something awfully close to that. Now, if that's what's happening, if they're actually reacting before they report that they feel anything, then it doesn't seem like it could be the feeling that's causing the reaction. Now, there are interesting questions to be asked, even if we have a study that shows that. How's the study put together? Right? What other explanations can we have about the results of the study? Right? What's actually going on? What's the experiment? What are the results? How do we interpret those results? What do they show us? Because, of course, there might be a study that claims to show this sort of thing, but it really doesn't. Okay, so second. So the second objection to epiphenomenalism. So a second reason to believe that qualia really must be efficacious given that they exist. Second one is just that evolution wouldn't favor the production of qualia. They didn't contribute towards their survival. If they're just a byproduct with no further effects, they don't actually cause our bodies to do anything, then it seems like wasted resources to produce those things for no benefit. Well, Jackson responds to this as well. He says, look, evolution is just not a perfect system. It's not designed to be sort of produce perfectly efficient creatures, to adapt creatures perfectly to their environment. It's, to put it into Richard Dawkins' phrase, evolution is sort of like a blind watchmaker, right? It's making these products through really a system of trial and error. This might be unfair to a blind watchmaker. But what it's really doing is heartlessly exterminating creatures that aren't adapted enough to survive in their environments. So as long as creatures have enough traits to allow their survival, that's really all evolution cares about. Now, in situations of limited resources, there will be competition, and so the better adapted will out-survive the worse adapted. But this can be something that extends over geological time. It can take a very long amount of time for this to actually happen. So what you're going to get are really mixed bags of traits. So, of course, you're not going to have a creature that has like no traits at all that are advantageous to its survival. They're just going to die. But you are going to have mixed bags of traits. Some traits are just byproducts of other traits, and so we need to be careful about what we're pointing at. Jackson gives the example of a polar bear. specifically a polar bear's coat. Now, the polar bear's coat is warm, which is good for its survival, given that it tries to survive in a cold climate. But that coat's also heavy, right? Part of the reason that it is so warm is because it's heavy. But being heavy is not good for the polar bear's survival. It takes more energy to drag around that heavy coat to move around. So if we just look at the heaviness, right, and say, well, look, evolution made polar bears' coats heavy, and heavy coats aren't conducive to survival because they take more energy to move around than lighter coats. So evolution is false or something like this. But that's really not a fair argument because you have to take them as a package. For the coat to be warm, it also needs to be heavy. So altogether, the warmth and the heaviness contribute to the polar bear's survival. Now, just extrapolating on that and thinking just a little bit in the future, if in fact the climate warms to such a degree that up in, say, the Arctic, you don't have the same kind of ice and the same kind of cold temperatures where the polar bears need that heavy coat to survive, if the environment changes enough, then in fact that trait, right, or that set of traits, having a heavy coat that's also warm, might actually wind up being bad for the polar bear's survival because now you've just got a heavy coat, which takes more energy to move around. But if you don't need the warmth, you're not deriving the benefit from it. So thinking to our brains and thinking about qualia, how does this relate back over? Well, the story goes something like this. Evolving the highly sophisticated brains that we have was useful for the survival of humans. By evolving that sophisticated brain, we're able to adapt to environments much more quickly. We're able to produce tools and culture to think about things in a sophisticated way, to theorize, to think about hypothetical situations and so on. It's given us huge advantages to survival, right, as a physical mechanism. Now, the actual qualia that comes along with it can just be a byproduct, right? Having a brain like ours is the sort of thing that produces qualia, right? Other sorts of organisms that have some kind of brain, right, some kind of neural system, depending on what it is and how advanced it is, they might just not have what we have. Maybe they don't actually feel things, even though they behave in ways that we do. You know, they pull back from a pain stimulus or seek certain sorts of things, have certain kinds of behaviors. But if they aren't as adaptable as we are, right, they just sort of pursue certain courses of action almost in a pre-programmed way, maybe they don't have qualia the way we do. Now, Jackson doesn't explore this too much, but this is just the idea that having a sophisticated physical organ like we do, our brain, is what allows for qualia to be produced. Qualia itself doesn't contribute to our survival, right? But it's a byproduct. So it's not that evolution was intentionally trying to make qualia, just like evolution wasn't trying to make just a heavy coat for the polar bear. Rather, it's the warm coat for the polar bear that helps their survival, just like it's the sophisticated brain that helps with our survival. The byproducts are the heaviness of the polar bear's coat and the qualia of our brain functioning. So this is a way to think that evolution really could, in fact, make something like us that produces qualia as a kind of byproduct that itself has no further function. All right, third objection. The issue of other minds. How do we know that other humans have minds? Well, based on their behaviors, right? Or at least we believe they're like us based on their behaviors. Although humans behave in different sorts of ways, largely speaking, we behave in fairly similar ways. We have language, we move around, we seek food and shelter and so on. We like to learn things, at least to some degree. We might like to learn different things and eat different foods and have different beliefs and so on, live different places. But there are underlying similarities. So generally speaking, we infer that other humans have minds like ours due to their behavior. But if qualia are epiphenomenal, that is, they don't cause anything else, they're just effects that are finished, right? They're just sort of byproducts or side effects. Then we don't really have grounds to infer that other humans have minds like ours insofar as they actually experience qualia. Right? We've got reason to believe that other humans have, say, brains like we do because of their behaviors. But we might, each of us, be the only ones in the world or the whole universe that actually feel anything. Right? All the other humans when they react to a pain stimulus might just be reacting to the pain stimulus without actually feeling the pain. When they smell a rose and go, oh, that rose smells lovely, that could be explained purely in behavioral terms. So think back to SMART, where we've got sort of SMART in the middle with the identity theory. There's dualism on the one hand and behaviorism on the other. This is really an argument towards behaviorism. If we have, in our explanation of human behavior, if qualia play no actual role, then it seems like we lose our reason to infer that other humans have qualia, that they actually feel things, precisely because that plays no role in our explanation anymore. We ought to opt for the simplest explanation of phenomena. And if the simplest explanation doesn't involve qualia, even if we have to admit that it exists for each of us individually, then maybe we have no reason to think that other humans or other beings experience those sorts of things. Jackson responds to this and says, well, this argument isn't as good as it seems at first. Now we infer that other humans have minds like ours based on their behavior, right? And based on their behavior, the way that we can make the inference is that we can infer that they have brains like we do, right? Function in the same sorts of ways. It's the brains that cause the other humans to behave the way they do. And based on that inference itself, we go from their behavior to their brain. He said we can go from the fact that we believe they have a brain like we do to the conclusion that they also experience qualia the way we do, precisely because they have the same kind of brain. Right? So even though the qualia plays no explanatory role in the behavior of other humans, what we have here is a common cause, namely the activity of the human brain, which causes both the behavior of the individual and the qualia, though it's causing them separately, because those two things don't interact with each other. It's not the qualia that causes the behavior, rather it's the brain activity that causes both things at the same time, or effectively the same time. So Jackson says we do have reason to believe that other humans can experience qualia too. And it's really just a modified version of the reasoning that we use to believe that they have minds in the first place, namely that they behave the way we do. It's just now the way that inference works is instead of saying other humans behave the way we do because they have qualia, and qualia is what causes them to behave in a certain kind of way. Now we say other humans behave the way we do because they have brains like ours, and if you have a brain like ours, then you're going to have qualia, because it's brains like ours that produce qualia as well as the behaviors that are associated with them. So that's the third reason. Jackson explores the third objection to the epiphenomenal position, that qualia exist but are causally inert, causally inefficacious. So he's given this view, really. What's a summary of the view so far? Qualia exist. We have to admit they exist to have a full explanation of the world. Qualia, and this is what the knowledge argument shows, and the two examples, Fred the tomato sorter, Mary the neuroscientist. Qualia, even though they exist, aren't causally efficacious. We don't need to believe that they actually cause anything. They can just be byproducts or side effects of other physical processes. Let's take a look at these three objections to that view that qualia are epiphenomenal and respond to each of them. So now he just comes around to this last point, which is really another defense against something like Smart's position. Now, Jackson ultimately concludes this, which is a nice way to just sum up epiphenomenalism. Qualia cause nothing physical, but are caused by something physical. Physical processes produce qualia, but qualia themselves don't have any effect on physical processes. Right? This is really the view. Now, if that's the case, if qualia are just the side effect, they themselves play no causal role in what's going on, we could take the view that they play no explanatory role either. And so if you think back to the free will discussion, think about Campbell, right, and think about Ayer. Campbell says, look, determinists will argue that there's only one real way to explain anything or make it intelligible or meaningful, and that's to give it a causal explanation. Campbell rejected that. Ayer took that up. Arguably, Smart takes up that view as well, that really the only real explanation for something is pointing to causes. Now, on Smart's view, given that everything that's going on is really just brains and various sorts of brain states and physical interactions, that's all there is to explain. That's all we have to talk about. There just isn't anything more to be said. There's nothing more to account for. Jackson disagrees and says you can have all the physical information, and still not have explained qualia. So there is something more there. There is something more to, in some sense, explain or take into a full account of the universe and our place within it, even though that explanation isn't going to involve causes. We can point to qualia as being the effects of certain other causes, but they themselves aren't going to help explain anything else because they don't cause anything. So one view that Smart arguably takes up, and somebody like Ayer might take up as well, and perhaps Mackey, so you can actually see this throughout the course now, that there are certain sort of philosophical sympathies, right? There's certain key questions that philosophers often develop a certain kind of answer to, and that influences a lot of their further answers. And this is something, as you've been working through the course, if you've sort of answered a question one way and later you might have a similar kind of question come up, you might find yourself thinking about how your views on one question start influencing your views on another. Sometimes you might say, oh, I already answered it this way over here, so I'll answer it this way over here to be consistent. Or maybe you answer them differently. And then over time, you come to realize that you step back and say, well, I answered this question one way here, and I seem to answer basically the same question different way there. And now I've got a tension between those two things. So how do I pull them together? How do I square the circle? Do I have to change all my answers? Can I make them compatible? Do I actually have a coherent view or not? This is really what doing philosophy over time looks like. You take some issue, you put it in little bite-sized chunks, you think about each of the little chunks, you try to come up with a view on it, a good, reasonable view. You then start piecing together those small pieces you've analyzed back together, seeing how good answers to different sorts of questions fit together or not. Okay, so coming back to the topic, getting off this little side rant here, we could hold something like Smart's view that we should just reject qualia from our ontology. Ontology, basically like theory of what exists, right? This is what Smart's doing. Look, qualia don't explain anything. They play no causal role in anything. So there's just no point in talking about them, right? Just give up on that. There's nothing, there's no advance there to be had. There's no answers to any good questions. So just forget about it. Jackson's response here is really a claim to humility. Really, in closing, Jackson appeals to the fact that we are evolved creatures. And just like with the polar bear example, our brains have evolved to serve certain sorts of survival functions. Now, they do more than just that, but we shouldn't assume that we're perfect, that somehow we've been adapted to be able to know everything there is to know about the universe and fully understand everything there is to know. Jackson gives a funny little example to some other evolved creatures. I'll let you go look it up, but in a different sort of environment, who could be doing the same kind of thing that, say, somebody like Smart is, and assuming that what they know about their little environment, the way they understand the world, is just the only way there is to know things at all. Jackson thinks that view is overly optimistic. Right? He says, look, it just might be the case that there are some things we just can't explain. Right? Why do brains like ours produce qualia? Maybe we can never answer that question. Right? Maybe we just go through and we look at all the physical processes, and when we've done all the science we can possibly do over, let's call it 1 million years, or however long it might be, then that's just a question that it's just there. Right? Our answer is just, well, they do. And there's nothing more to be said about it. So he really closes in making this appeal to humility and saying, look, we shouldn't assume that we are so sophisticated and so well adapted to the world we live in that we'll be able to explain everything, right? We shouldn't also expect that the world itself is really put together in such a way that it's going to be fully sensible to creatures like us. So we might have here just a deep puzzle, something that we're never able to give a full and satisfactory explanation about. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to explain and that we should just exclude qualia from our ontology. We should just deny that they exist entirely. So that's Jackson's piece. So as you can see, he's trying to defend a somewhat moderate view, saying that there really are mental properties, there are qualia, there's something to the mind that's more than just the brain. But he's also trying to privilege physical processes and say those mental properties, those qualia, even though they exist and we have to admit they exist, they themselves don't play any causal role. They don't really explain anything else. We have to admit they're there to have a full explanation of the world, but they're not going to explain any further thing, right? So if you're doing psychology or neuroscience or studying human behavior at all, you're never going to have to appeal to qualia and what people actually feel or anything like that to explain what they do. You could fully explain physical processes in terms of other physical processes. Now this brings us around to our last reading in this unit from Alan Turing. Now you've probably heard of Turing one way or another. There's a movie about him a few years ago. Very brilliant British thinker. He was persecuted for his homosexuality, which ultimately led to his death. But during World War II, he helped develop some of the early electronic computers, helped hugely with the Allied efforts at decoding Nazi Enigma encoded messages, encrypted messages. So really a pretty brilliant guy, and was also an early figure in thinking about artificial intelligence. And that's really the piece we're looking at here. Now, the piece is much longer than what we got. This is really just out of the first couple of pages where Turing is making this proposal, a way to think about what it means for artificial intelligence to exist. So, oh, I just realized that I'm covering up something important here, so I'm going to move myself in a way that hopefully doesn't interfere with anything. All right, so this piece is from 1950, right? So it's after the war. Computing machinery and intelligence. So Turing is really interested in this question, can machines think? Right? And now that we've looked at these two different views, we can think just for a moment about what that might be. For Smart might hold the view that, and in fact, other philosophers after Smart have held positions similar to what I'm going to describe here, but we won't bother with the details. So can machines think? Well, if you're a physicalist like Smart and you say really all that exists are physical processes, for a machine to think doesn't mean that there's anything going on beyond some kind of physical process. So we might hold one of two views, minimally, and there can be more. One view is that to think means to have a brain like ours, made of stuff like our brain is made of, and to function the way our brain does. Can a machine think? No, because it's not made of the right kind of stuff, right? It's not a biological organism. You have to be a biological carbon-based organism of some sort to be thinking. And even then, your brain has to have a certain kind of structure to it. It has to be able to have certain sorts of states. Another way of thinking about it, even if you're in some sense a physicalist, and you say, okay, I don't think there are mental things that go beyond physical things, you can be what's typically called a functionalist. Instead of talking about how the thing is structured, how it's put together, you instead talk about its functions or what it can do in some sense, right? There you can still be a physicalist, but instead of thinking just in terms of how's the thing put together, you think about it in terms of what can it do. There's some analogy here, if we think back to ethics, between being sort of a Kantian, right? The form of the thing, how it's put together, what the specific action is or something like that, versus the consequences, right? If you're someone like Mill, or the outputs, right? The functions that can be performed by the thing. Now, if we think about Jackson doesn't explicitly explore this, but can machines think? Well, on Jackson's view, given that he thinks that there is qualia, there's mental stuff beyond physical stuff, for a machine to think, we might mean by that question, do machines experience qualia? Do they feel pains and smell roses? Right? We might argue if they don't, but they merely mimic that behavior. They have the right functions, but don't actually have the feelings associated with it. By the way, I don't know what this was. Eating, I guess. Then they don't really think, right? They might have the same behaviors and functions, but they don't really think, right? That could be another way to take this question. Now, it's precisely in part because this question is sort of an open one. You know, what do we really mean by it? How would we answer it? That Turing wants to investigate it. And Turing says, sort of tongue-in-cheek, he says, you know, can machines think? This isn't the sort of question we can answer with a Gallup poll. You can't go around and ask all the machines, okay, machine one, do you think? Machine two, do you think? Right? He says that's not the right way to think about this question. So what is the right way to think about it? This is where he proposes what he calls the imitation game. The imitation game involves two humans, right, A and B. One is supposed to be a male, one's a female. So A is a male, B is a female. And they engage with an interrogator. I should have put this on the slide, but the interrogator is also human. Right? So we've got three humans. Now, what happens in the game is this. A and B communicate with the interrogator, and Turing suggests this should be done through teletype. Think just like social media, text messaging or something, right? Just so that the interrogator doesn't hear differences in their voices and start making inferences about who's who based on what they sound like. So they're supposed to communicate with the interrogator. The interrogator asks questions. This is really what it is to be an interrogator, right? Now, the purpose of the game is for the interrogator to correctly identify which of the two is the male and which one's the female. And now Turing is invoking some, basically sort of sexist standards here, 1950 about, say, things like hair length. So the interrogator is going to ask all these questions. The interrogator can't just ask, A, are you male or female? But rather can ask other sorts of questions that Turing thinks is going to help lead to an answer. So he gives the example of asking, the interrogator asks one of them what their hair is like. And they answer that, oh, their hair's fairly long and they've got a certain hairstyle, which would seem to be indicative of, say, being a woman. Turing takes that to be. Now, in the game, A, the male, is trying to trick the interrogator into believing that he is really the female. Right? So A lies. A will give answers to try to trick the interrogator into miscorrectly identifying. B, the female, gives truthful answers and actually is trying to help the interrogator make the right sort of decision. But A and B can't just come out and say, oh yeah, I'm really the man or woman or something like that. Even if they could, it doesn't really matter, because of course they would both then be saying the same kind of thing. And the interrogator is just getting this, in writing or kind of playing a game of telephone. They can work through an intermediary, right? They can ask somebody else to ask one of the people and then get the response through the intermediary. So they're never directly interacting with them. So the interrogator is trying to say, okay, this one's the man and that one's the woman based on the answers to the questions. The man is trying to trick the interrogator into thinking he's the woman. The woman is trying to help the interrogator correctly identify her as the woman and the other one as the man. Now, so this is the default setup for the game, right? The interrogator is trying to identify who's who. The other two, one is trying to be truthful, the other one is trying to be tricky. And so Turing wants to reformulate this original question. Can machines think? He says, let's reformulate that to a different question. What will happen when a machine takes the part of A in this game? What happens when a machine takes the part of, say, the man, and now the game, instead of trying to determine who's the man, who's the woman, now the game is to try to figure out who is the human, who is the machine, right? Now we've got a different sort of game on our hands, especially these days. So Turing is well ahead of his time. Of course, 1950s, you're not going to have anything nearly sophisticated enough to be able to pull this off and actually trick the interrogator. But this has come to be known as the Turing Test, and it's been widely used for a number of years now with people, right, teams of people trying to make an artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to actually be able to trick a human into thinking that it itself is a human. Right? Now, we can't know what a machine really thinks, just like we can't know what another human thinks. So if you think back to what Jackson was talking about, how do we infer that other humans experience qualia? Well, based on their behavior. We infer they have a brain like ours, and brains like ours, we infer, are the sorts of things that produce qualia. As we produce more and more sophisticated machines that are better and better able to mimic human behavior, or perhaps I should reformulate that in a more neutral way, are able to behave more and more like humans are in a way that makes it harder and harder to actually differentiate robot behavior from human behavior, or machine behavior from human behavior. If we get to a point where there just is no way to distinguish between a human and a machine based on behavior, based on what's going on the outside, right? Then what sort of position are we in terms of determining whether or not that machine thinks. Now, of course, we might appeal to their outside, so I've gone overboard and put in a few pictures this time. So with this picture, this one's sort of interesting because what's going on here? Well, you've probably seen this in popular culture somehow or other, right? Sci-fi movies or books or shows. Maybe you're not interested in sci-fi, but you probably just have some general sense of the theme. What if we not only make machines behave like humans do in a way that makes it hard, if not perhaps impossible in practice, to determine who's a human and who's a machine just based on their behavior, but if we also make them look like humans, right? What if they've got the external appearance of humans? What if we give them either some kind of synthetic exterior, right? So they look human, but maybe it's not really flesh. Or we do something like, say, in the Terminator series, you've got a robot covered in real, actual human flesh. So other than just like opening the thing up or doing some kind of X-ray, there's no way to tell whether or not it's a machine or a human. Now, really, the way Turing wants to think about this, the question of can a machine think, if we go back to how I was talking about it before, it's not a question of do they have qualia, do they actually feel what we feel? It's just a question of do they have the right sorts of functions or outputs? Do they behave in the right ways? If they behave in the right ways, then maybe it doesn't really matter what they're made up of or if they really feel what we do. After all, whether or not other humans feel what we do itself is something that's, in some sense, open to doubt. Now, I'm not telling you to believe that you're the only human in the world that actually feels anything. Not only would that be very lonely, I don't think there are really good reasons to believe it. But then we come around to thinking about machines. Is it possible that at some point a machine would develop the capability to produce qualia? I don't see any a priori reasons, any reasons in principle to deny that fact. Though we might fall back on the other physicalist view that I outlined just as we started talking about this, that to be able to produce qualia, you have to be made of the right kind of stuff. That is, you have to be a carbon-based life form. Your brain has to have the right sort of electric and chemical signals going on in there, right? So a machine maybe in principle just isn't the right kind of thing to be able to have feelings. Maybe, right? That might be the right view. And there's a philosopher named John Searle who's defended that view for a number of years. But it seems at least possible, right? It seems open to defense or attack to hold the view that, in fact, machines, if sophisticated enough, are the sorts of things that can produce qualia themselves. And if we think, okay, if we believe that to think means to experience qualia, then it seems at least possible machines could do that. If we think, no, if we believe that to think doesn't mean you have to have qualia, right? We're a physicalist or something like that. We just deny qualia exists. Then what are we stuck with? Well, really a debate between what matters more, the behaviors, the functions, the things we observe, or the actual state, right? Say the brain state you're in when you feel pain versus the mechanical state, right? That the machine's in when it behaves as if it's feeling pain. So there's an interesting open question here about which view is really the right one. Now, of course, I can't settle it here, but I wanted to raise it in particular because we're entering an age where this is becoming more and more pressing. When we get to a point where a machine can perfectly behave like a human, so much so that you can't tell from its behavior alone that it's actually a machine, does it now start qualifying as a thing that's thinking? And is being a thing that thinks enough to start making it be a person, at least to some degree? And this brings us back to Midgley's question. If machines can really think, if they can behave the way humans behave, at least well enough, then is it the case that at least some machines, at some point, and potentially in the near future, are going to have to be considered persons to some degree, that is, to be the sorts of things that are taken into account when we're thinking morally and when we're thinking legally? Are machines the sorts of things that can have rights someday? I'm not really sure, but it seems like, just from what we've looked at here, there's at least one avenue to argue that machines really should be persons, at least to some degree, and that's going to be by arguing that they are thinking things. But to be able to assert that machines are really thinking, we need to get a clear picture of what it means to think. This is really part of what Turing was trying to do in his piece, And that's really all we're going to look at here, just that formulation, just that way to think about it. And I've just tried to seed your thinking a little about bringing Turing into conversation with both Jackson as well as Smart. All right, well, that's it for this video lecture. I hope it's been clear and enjoyable. This concludes our philosophy of mind unit, which also concludes the metaphysics unit. So if you want to write the third and final critical response, which itself is optional, take your best 2 of 3 grades. So if you only write 2, I'll take the grades from those 2 and I compute your final grade. If you write all 3, I will simply drop the lowest grade. So if you do want to write on the metaphysics unit, that's really anything in free will or philosophy of mind that includes Campbell, Ayer, Smart, Jackson, and Turing. So feel free to be in touch if you want to run anything by me or ask me any questions. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day and that things are going as well as possible. I'll see you next time.